Smile 2 picks up shortly after the first movie ends, this time following a mega pop star, Sky Riley, played by Naomi Scott. When the stress of being days away from a comeback world tour gets to her, Sky reaches out to an old acquaintance for painkillers, only to witness his self-mutilation and death, passing a malicious force to her. Parker Finn returns as the writer and director, and in my opinion has seemed to refine his skills in both of these departments for this movie. I enjoyed the first Smile movie. I remember being pleasantly surprised with it when I watched it originally because I expected more or less a horror schlock movie, and the premise alone of an entity that makes people appear to smile at you in a evil way is in itself creepy. It also does a good job at walking this careful line of if it's done wrong, it could very easily be goofy, but if it's done right, it can be very creepy. And Finn leans more into this for this movie. Now, I've also seen some people aptly compare this movie to Perfect Blue, an animated movie from the late 90s from Satoshi Kon about a pop singer driven insane by an obsessed stalker. And really all I have to say about Perfect Blue is that if you haven't seen it, what are you doing with your life? Go watch it now. You can definitely see some of its inspiration in the movie, and I think that aspect works really well and is the biggest benefit to the movie. The scale of Smile 2 feels much bigger than the first one. Now that the entity is latched onto someone with the celebrity status and public persona of Sky Riley, it feels like there's a lot more at stake, not only from the perspective of an evil force being attached to someone that famous, but also the personal stakes for the character. She has to maintain her own sanity while making sure no one close to her or the public thinks that she's fallen off the wagon. The movie starts with Sky doing an interview as a prerequisite for her tour, explaining that a year beforehand she was in a car accident that killed her boyfriend, and they were both on a lot of hard substances, /drunk at the time, causing the crash. She now needs to get back on the public's good side and prove to them and herself that she is sober and ready to entertain again. Now, I do honestly think that Naomi Scott is the best part of this movie. She is astounding here. When horror is utilized well and its story elements work towards actually fleshing out the characters in this high stress, raw emotion environment, you can get some all-time great performances. That's one reason that in the last decade especially, a lot of actresses have been praised for career best performances in recent horror movies. This remains true for Scott. I'm not overly familiar with her entire filmography, but I've seen her in things here and there over the last handful of years, and this is easily my favorite performance from her so far. She is very believable as this mega pop star. She has the look for it, and there is a lot of legitimate effort put into the movie to make the presentation of this character feel like she's on the scale of someone like Ariana Grande in the real world. The couple songs that are featured throughout the movie are also fairly catchy, and the stage direction, choreography, and overall visuals sell this. Naomi is able to capture this just under the surface fragility of this character, who has been somewhat shoved back into the spotlight when she's not ready for it. There's one scene that does feature a snippet of the immediate aftermath of the crash that injured her and killed her boyfriend, and Naomi's crying and emotions in this moment does come across as very genuine and did admittedly get me to tear up when it happened, which I really didn't expect with this type of movie. This is not an easy role at all. The movie follows Sky very closely, and Naomi has a lot of very intense scenes that, just from an acting perspective, look incredibly draining and just exhausting. She's great here, and is another reason I wish acting in horror movies was more recognized come awards season in general. I do also think the story is significantly better here than the first movie. I was very invested in Sky as a character and was rooting for her to fight back throughout. Finn tackles the subject matters of addiction, grief, recovery, and fame. The already significant pressure of Sky's fame hindering her addiction recovery starts to snowball when the Smile entity moves to her. Now, if you haven't seen the first movie, the entity moves from person to person by making the carrier kill themselves in front of a witness. It's a fairly straightforward allegory for trauma and how it affects other people. This entity spends the next week tormenting the host by making them hallucinate and question their reality, working its way from a bump in the dark all the way up to a mob chasing you in your apartment. It wants to break the host mentally before it takes it over. It makes them look as insane as possible to the people in their lives, and it spends the week torturing the person to their emotional breaking point. I really enjoyed the look of this movie as well. It is very slickly and stylistically shot. Credit to Charlie Saroff, the cinematographer. It has a very crisp and snappy look to it that works really well for the intense close-ups that a lot of these characters have. I think Finn improves upon his style from the first movie, and it feels like he's more confident as a director here. The movie also has a cold open that is a single tracking shot, and while you can argue that tracking shots can be gimmicky or whatever, but this one is done really well and works for this part of the story. It kind of puts you in that immediate mindset that, oh, they're putting in a good amount of effort into how they're presenting this. As far as the actual horror of the movie, I do think this one is scarier than the first one too. I don't find these particularly scary myself overall, but I do think that most of the scares work pretty well, and I know if I was 13, it'd probably terrify me. There are a couple different set pieces in the movie that work really, really well. One that has been shown quite a bit in the trailers is when what looks like a big group of fans break into Sky's apartment and chase her around. Once again, it walks this line between funny and terrifying. It's a totally ridiculous kind of what the fuck image that is scary for the same reason. A lot of just the imagery itself in this movie is unsettling. It gets under your skin. It is a concept that I think is universally just kind of a creepy one to a lot of people. Now, this movie and the first does occasionally rely on a handful of jump scares. I've never really been a big fan of jump scares and do normally feel like most are cheap. However, there are a couple in here that did get me aside from just making me jump. I mentioned before that Finn leans more into the comedic aspect of his concept with this movie, and that's one of my favorite parts. This is a surprisingly funny movie. There are several legitimately funny moments that contrast the scary moments in a very effective way. I like when horror movies work these moments in, and I really enjoyed it here, especially with Dylan Galula's character, Gemma, Sky's former best friend. Now, like I said, I do think that this story is better than the first one. I do think the character work in this movie is very well done. I like that it explored a lot of Sky's relationships to the people around her and how she has to not only gain the trust of these people like her mother, who's also her manager, but her former best friend and her assistant. She has to put on this image that she's not necessarily ready to put on and gain these people's trust back while also trying to gain back the trust of the public. It plays into these insecurities that would probably be pretty prevalent for someone who is that famous, and only folds in on itself with having the supernatural horror element where the smile entity is specifically playing on people's biggest fears and insecurities about themselves, because it's trying to make them feel as low as possible. I thought a lot of the interactions between especially Sky and her mom were done really well. The dialogue felt believable, and a lot of the reactions that she has to a lot of this stuff does feel believable. There is an aspect to horror movies where characters do feel just kind of stupid, and you don't really get that here, which I do always appreciate when they make the character believable and not just kind of stumble through the story. A lot of what this character does have to balance here is very intense, and a lot of the reactions that she has to things happening around here do also feel believable, and you can understand why people would not believe her. The movie is written well enough where it does get you completely on her side, because you are wanting her to prove that these things are happening to her and it's not just her falling off the wagon. So I think the character work is very, very strong, especially for Sky Riley. Now, I saw this movie with one of my friends, and he did mention that he thinks this movie almost works better as a story by itself, outside of the smile concept. I do agree with him to a certain extent. Having to stay within the confines of the rules of the Smile movies is almost to the story's detriment. But I do also like when movies play with specific stories within a genre and twist it. I do, however, have some gripes with the movie. I do think some of the pacing towards the end of the second act was a little wonky. It does play into Sky's emotional breaking point, trying to prove that she's not crazy before the third act starts, and what it's going to take to get her to that breaking point. And while I do think that this particular sequence works fine, I do kind of wish it went in a different direction, especially because the previous scene is done really, really well. And that's only really because it felt like it did slow the story down more than it needed to, and it lost some of its momentum. My biggest issue is with the ending of the movie. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I will talk about some of the choices made and why I kind of disagree with them. The ending itself I did really, really like. I think what happens is a huge oh moment slash twist that will go down as a very memorable ending. However, I don't really like how it gets there. There is an aspect of story writing that I really don't like to see, and that's when a writer has obviously written themselves into a corner, so they have to break the rules to get out of it because they couldn't write themselves out of it. Now, the Smile entity is a reality-bending monster. That's kind of the whole point of how it scares its host. And there are a handful of plot twists that happen, especially in the second half of the movie, where they all work well for the most part, but some of them do feel predictable, while the big one that isn't predictable is because there's no hint that that particular thing could happen. Sometimes when movies pull out this big hat trick where the audience didn't know something could happen, it does end up feeling a little cheap. And I did feel like some of the choices and twists were a little cheap when it could have really done something more interesting to get to the same ending. Overall, though, I was surprised by how much I dug this movie. I was enthralled the entire time and really look forward to there being another sequel if there is one. Parker Finn's becoming a director to look out for, and Naomi Scott deserves all the praise for this movie. I am going to be rating Smile 2 a B-. It's a very solid horror movie. I do recommend going to see it if you are interested. I am interested to know what everybody else thought. If they liked the first one more or this one, let me know, and I will be back with another video.